Your primitive brain is sabotaging you constantly, driving decisions designed for survival in ancient environments, not success in modern world, making you reactive when strategy is required, choosing immediate over important repeatedly, controlled by fear, anger, and impulse that served ancestors but destroy your potential, operating on outdated programming, keeping you poor, undisciplined, and stuck while rational people override primitive circuits, building success that your unconscious instincts make permanently impossible. This primitive brain sabotage is systematically destroying your potential by ensuring ancient survival instincts override modern success requirements, destroying your opportunities by making you choose comfort over growth, destroying your relationships through emotional reactions, replacing thoughtful responses, destroying your wealth by prioritizing spending over investing, destroying your health through immediate pleasure, replacing long-term discipline, and destroying your future by guaranteeing that primitive impulses control you rather than conscious strategic thinking, creating the life that primitive programming prevents. Stopping primitive brain sabotage is not eliminating emotions or becoming purely logical, but developing consciously override of destructive instincts, not about never feeling primitive impulses, but about not being controlled by them, and not mysterious ability, but result of understanding and systematically overriding specific primitive patterns. This audiobook teaches primitive brain override mastery through the comprehensive framework for stopping sabotage, the neuroscience of dual brain systems, revealing how primitive and rational circuits compete, the evolutionary psychology, showing why instincts designed for survival sabotaged success, the specific primitive patterns sabotaging modern life, and the systematic override strategies for each destructive primitive program. Stop being controlled by primitive instincts and start overriding destructive programming. Stop reacting primitively and start responding strategically. Understand dual brain systems. Recognize primitive sabotage patterns. Implement systematic override strategies. Develop conscious control and master primitive brain override, making modern success possible that primitive control makes permanently impossible through commitment. Starting now. Chapter 1. Understand your dual brain system and why primitive wins. Default. Understanding your dual brain system and why primitive wins by default reveals the fundamental challenge requiring conscious override for success. The dual system principle demonstrates that primitive limbic system evolved for survival makes decisions automatically. That rational prefrontal cortex evolved recently requires deliberate activation. That primitive brain operates faster than conscious thought. That emotional automatic system wins unless rational system is deliberately engaged, and that recognizing dual system is prerequisite for override. Most people remain controlled by primitive brain through not knowing dual systems exist, believing all decisions are rational, not recognizing when primitive circuits control behavior, never learning to activate rational override, and remaining unconscious of automatic primitive processing. Primitive brain wins by default. Conscious override enables success. Engage rational system or stay controlled. Research on dual processing demonstrates that System 1 is fast, automatic, emotional, primitive. That System 2 is slow, deliberate, rational, analytical. That System 1 activates automatically, while System 2 requires effort. That primitive brain makes most decisions unless conscious override engaged. And that understanding dual systems enables beginning to override primitive control. The primitive system characteristics include: operates unconsciously and automatically, prioritizes immediate survival over long-term success, driven by fear, anger, and desire, makes split-second decisions, controls behavior unless overridden, and evolved for ancient environment, not modern world. The rational system characteristics show requires conscious, deliberate activation, capable of long-term strategic thinking, can analyze and plan systematically, exhausts more quickly than automatic processing, enables success in modern world, and must be deliberately engaged to override primitive. The default primitive control means without conscious effort primitive wins. That automatic processing dominates behavior, that instinctive reactions control choices, that emotional impulses override strategy, and that remaining unconscious guarantees primitive control throughout life. The evolutionary mismatch reveals primitive brain evolved for survival in dangerous scarcity, that modern world rewards delayed gratification and strategic thinking, that instincts that kept ancestors alive sabotage modern success, That environment changed faster than evolution could adapt, and that conscious override of primitive programming is essential for thriving. The System 1 activation signs include immediate emotional reaction, automatic judgment without analysis, impulse to act instantly, physical sensations driving behavior, and decisions made before conscious awareness. The System 2 engagement requires deliberate pause before reaction, conscious questioning of automatic response, analytical thinking about situation, consideration of long-term consequences, and effortful override of immediate impulse. The recognition practice involves noticing when you react without thinking, identifying emotional automatic responses, catching primitive circuits, controlling behavior, becoming aware of System 1 activation, recognizing that most processing is primitive, not rational, and treating awareness as foundation for override. The implementation requires studying dual brain systems thoroughly, observing your automatic primitive reactions, recognizing when rational system is not engaged, accepting that primitive wins by default, understanding evolutionary mismatch, and treating conscious override as essential skill for modern success. Primitive brain wins by default. Conscious override enables success. Engage rational system or stay controlled. You understand now that dual systems compete for control. That primitive activates automatically while rational requires effort. That evolutionary mismatch causes instincts to sabotage success. That recognition is first step. And that Chapter 1 creates foundation by revealing dual system, making conscious override possible where unconscious primitive control made modern success impossible. Chapter 2. Stop primitive fear response from preventing risk and growth. Stopping primitive fear response from preventing necessary risk and growth enables moving beyond comfort into achievement territory. The fear override principle demonstrates that primitive brain treats all uncertainty as danger. That fear response evolved to prevent physical death, not modern risk. That avoiding all risk kept ancestors alive but keeps you poor. That successful people override fear taking calculated risks, and that distinguishing actual danger from discomfort enables growth. Most people are controlled by primitive fear through avoiding all situations triggering fear response, unable to distinguish real danger from growth, discomfort, letting fear prevent necessary risks, not recognizing that fear is primitive program, not truth, and remaining trapped in comfort zone by fear activation. Primitive fear prevents growth. Conscious override enables achievement. Act despite fear, or stay safe and stuck. Research on fear and amygdala demonstrates that amygdala triggers fear response automatically. That primitive fear doesn't distinguish physical from social threat. That fear evolved for immediate physical danger. That modern opportunities trigger inappropriate fear response, and that conscious override of fear enables calculated risk-taking. The primitive fear manifestations include fear of rejection preventing relationship pursuit, fear of failure preventing business attempts, fear of judgment preventing authentic expression, fear of loss preventing investment, fear of discomfort preventing growth, and fear of change keeping you stuck. The growth requirement reality shows all achievement requires moving beyond comfort. That risk is prerequisite for reward. That avoiding fear guarantees stagnation. That successful outcomes exist outside comfort zone, and that override of primitive fear is essential for growth. The fear versus danger distinction means actual danger threatens survival and should be avoided. That discomfort and uncertainty trigger fear but enable growth. That primitive brain conflates danger and discomfort. That learning distinction enables appropriate response, and that treating all fear as danger prevents achievement. The exposure protocol involves deliberately exposing yourself to feared situations progressively, starting with manageable fear levels, gradually increasing exposure as tolerance builds, recognizing that feared outcomes rarely materialize, building evidence that fear lies about danger, and treating exposure as systematic descent. The reframing practice shows viewing fear as signal of growth, opportunity, not danger. Recognizing fear means you're at edge of comfort. Understanding that fear indicates important territory. Treating fear as compass pointing toward growth. And using fear activation as guide rather than barrier. The somatic management includes recognizing physical fear sensations, breathing through fear activation, staying present despite discomfort, allowing fear without acting on it, and building tolerance through repeated exposure. The calculated risk framework involves distinguishing fear from actual danger assessment, evaluating real probability and consequence, making rational risk-reward analysis, acting based on analysis not fear, and building evidence that fear exaggerates threat. The implementation requires identifying fears preventing your growth, distinguishing real danger from primitive fear response, deliberately exposing yourself to growth discomfort, building tolerance through progressive exposure, reframing fear as growth signal, and using conscious override to act despite fear activation. Primitive fear prevents growth. Conscious override enables achievement. Act despite fear, or stay safe and stuck. You understand now that primitive fear treats uncertainty as danger, that modern opportunities trigger inappropriate fear response, that distinguishing discomfort from danger enables growth, that exposure builds tolerance, and that Chapter 2 reveals how conscious fear override makes achievement possible where primitive fear response made comfort zone imprisonment inevitable. Chapter 3. Override loss aversion, keeping you poor and risk-averse. Overriding loss aversion that keeps you poor and risk-averse enables wealth building through calculated risk despite primitive fear of losing. The loss aversion override demonstrates that primitive brain feels loss twice as intensely as gain. That fear of losing prevents rational risk-taking. That loss aversion kept resources safe, but prevents wealth building. That overriding loss aversion enables investment and growth, and that recognizing bias is first step to override. Most people remain poor through refusing opportunities because might lose, holding losing positions to avoid accepting loss, making conservative choices guaranteeing mediocrity, being paralyzed by fear of potential loss, and not recognizing that loss aversion sabotages wealth. Loss aversion keeps you poor. Rational override enables wealth. Calculate objectively, or stay broke. Research demonstrates that people feel loss approximately twice as intensely as equivalent gain, that loss aversion causes systematic poor decisions, that this bias prevents optimal risk-taking, that overriding loss aversion is essential for wealth, and that successful people consciously override loss aversion. The wealth prevention mechanism shows refusing to invest because might lose, holding bad investments to avoid accepting loss, not starting businesses due to fear of failure, choosing certain mediocre outcome over uncertain excellent one, and letting fear of loss prevent all wealth-building activities. The conscious override strategies involve calculating expected value objectively, separating emotion from probability and outcome, forcing rational analysis despite fear, asking what decision would be without loss aversion, deliberately choosing optimal despite fear of losing, and using frameworks that remove emotion. The reframe practice means viewing potential loss as price of opportunity, recognizing that avoiding all loss guarantees avoiding all gain. Understanding loss aversion keeps you poor, treating calculated risk as intelligence, accepting losses as part of wealth-building process, and knowing that staying safe guarantees staying poor. The expected value calculation shows multiplying probability by outcome for each possibility, comparing expected values objectively, making decisions based on mathematical advantage, removing emotional weight from analysis, and treating numbers as guide, not feelings. The loss acceptance protocol involves acknowledging when position is wrong, cutting losses quickly without emotional attachment, viewing losses as learning not failure, refusing to throw good money after bad, and treating quick loss cutting as intelligence. The opportunity cost awareness means recognizing that not risking has cost, that playing safe prevents wealth accumulation, that fear of loss creates opportunity loss, that conservative choices guarantee mediocre outcomes, and that inaction is expensive decision. The implementation requires identifying decisions where loss aversion controls you, calculating objective expected value, forcing consideration of opportunities despite fear, practicing small calculated risks, building tolerance, tracking decisions to see loss aversion patterns, and deliberately overriding primitive fear with rational analysis of risk-reward. Loss aversion keeps you poor. Rational override enables wealth. Calculate objectively or stay broke. You understand now that primitive brain feels loss disproportionately. That loss aversion prevents optimal risk-taking. That wealth requires accepting calculated losses. That rational analysis must override emotional fear. And that Chapter 3 reveals how conscious loss aversion override makes wealth building possible where primitive fear of losing made poverty inevitable. Chapter 4. Resist present bias, destroying long-term success for immediate pleasure. Resisting present bias that destroys long-term success for immediate pleasure enables building through delayed gratification. The present bias override demonstrates that primitive brain prioritizes now infinitely over later. That immediate gratification served survival but sabotages success. That resisting present bias requires conscious effort. That delayed gratification is essential for achievement. And that overriding immediate impulses builds everything significant. Most people sacrifice future through choosing immediate pleasure over long-term benefit, unable to delay gratification for larger rewards, making impulsive decisions, destroying future outcomes, prioritizing today at expense of tomorrow, and not recognizing how present bias sabotages building. Present bias destroys future. Delayed gratification builds success. Override impulses or sacrifice tomorrow. Research on temporal discounting demonstrates that people dramatically undervalue future rewards. That present bias is primitive survival instinct. That marshmallow test predicts life outcomes. That ability to delay gratification correlates with success. And that overriding present bias is trainable capacity. The sabotage manifestations include eating unhealthy for immediate pleasure despite health goals, spending impulsively instead of investing, choosing entertainment over important work, pursuing comfort at expense of achievement, and making decisions maximizing now while destroying later. The override strategies involve implementing delay between impulse and action, visualizing future self affected by present choice, using if-then planning preventing impulsive decisions, creating friction between impulse and gratification, bundling future building with immediate pleasure, and practicing voluntary discomfort building delay tolerance. The 10-second pause protocol means stopping before any impulsive action, breathing through immediate urge, asking what future me would want, visualizing long-term consequences, and choosing based on future not present. The future self connection involves writing letters to future you, using aged photos as a reminder, imagining conversations with future self, treating future you as a real person deserving protection, and building emotional bond enabling sacrifice. The implementation intention framework shows creating if-then statements for predictable impulses, pre-deciding responses before temptation, automating resistance through planning, removing decision from critical moment, and treating pre-commitment as binding. The friction engineering means removing instant gratification from environment, adding barriers between impulse and action, making delayed option easiest path, requiring multiple steps to give in, and using design to prevent impulsive choices. The implementation requires recognizing when present bias drives choices, creating systematic delays before acting, visualizing long-term consequences, using implementation intentions, building capacity through progressive practice, and treating delayed gratification as essential success skill requiring systematic override of primitive present bias. Present bias destroys future. Delayed gratification builds success. Override impulses or sacrifice tomorrow. You understand now that primitive brain prioritizes immediate over important. That present bias systematically sabotages long-term building. That delayed gratification requires conscious override. That multiple strategies enable resistance. And that Chapter 4 reveals how systematic present bias override makes future success possible, where primitive immediate gratification made long-term achievement impossible. Chapter 5. Control primitive anger, preventing strategic response. Under pressure. Controlling primitive anger that prevents strategic response under pressure enables maintaining rationality when it matters most. The anger override principle demonstrates that primitive anger evolved for physical confrontation. That modern success requires emotional regulation, not rage. That anger impairs rational thinking dramatically. That strategic response under pressure requires conscious control. And that overriding anger is essential leadership capacity. Most people are sabotaged by anger through reacting with rage, when strategy required, saying or doing destructive things during anger, losing access to rational brain under pressure, unable to control emotional reactions, and not recognizing how anger destroys important outcomes. Primitive anger destroys outcomes. Emotional control enables success. Pause before reacting or sabotage everything. Research demonstrates that anger activates amygdala, impairing prefrontal cortex. That emotional hijacking prevents rational thought. that angry decisions are consistently poor decisions, that emotional regulation improves outcomes dramatically, and that anger control is trainable skill. The anger manifestations include sending angry messages, destroying relationships, making fear-based decisions during rage, impulsive reactions damaging career, saying things that cannot be taken back, losing control when pressure is highest, and letting anger sabotage critical moments. The override strategies involve recognizing physiological signs of anger activation, implementing mandatory pause before any response, using structured protocols preventing angry reactions, practicing emotional regulation techniques, treating anger as signal to slow down, and never making decisions in angry state. The physiological recognition means noticing increased heart rate, feeling heat or tension, observing clenched jaw or fists, recognizing shallow breathing, identifying physical anger markers, and using body signals as warning system. The mandatory pause protocol shows taking 10 deep breaths before responding, removing yourself from situation temporarily, writing response but not sending immediately, waiting 24 hours before important reactions, and treating pause as non-negotiable rule. The cognitive reframing involves questioning angry interpretation, considering alternative explanations, asking if anger serves you, recognizing that anger clouds judgment, and choosing response based on goals, not emotion. The structured response system means having predetermined protocols for anger situations, following decision tree when angry, using scripts preventing impulsive reactions, consulting trusted person before acting, and treating structure as protection from emotional decisions. The regulation techniques include deep breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, physical exercise dissipating anger, meditation building baseline calm, and journaling processing emotions safely. The implementation requires identifying anger triggers, pre-planning responses to predictable situations, practicing regulation techniques daily, creating rules preventing angry decisions, using pause protocol automatically, and treating anger control as essential capacity. Primitive anger destroys outcomes. Emotional control enables success. Pause before reacting or sabotage everything. You understand now that primitive anger evolved for physical confrontation, not modern situations. That rage impairs rational thinking when it matters most. That emotional regulation requires systematic practice. That pause enables strategic response. And that Chapter 5 reveals how conscious anger control makes strategic action possible, where primitive rage made destructive reactions inevitable. Chapter 6. Override social conformity instinct, keeping you mediocre with herd. Overriding social conformity instinct that keeps you mediocre with herd enables independent thinking, creating exceptional results. The conformity override demonstrates that primitive brain follows crowd for tribal survival. That conformity was adaptive in tribes but liability in modern competition. That following herd guarantees average results. That independent thinking requires resisting social proof. And that exceptional outcomes require different choices than crowd. Most people remain mediocre through following crowd without independent analysis, conforming to avoid social rejection, unable to think differently than group, making decisions based on what others do, and not recognizing how conformity prevents excellence. Following crowd guarantees mediocrity. Independent thinking creates excellence. Think differently or stay average. Research demonstrates that people follow crowd even when obviously wrong, that social proof is powerful automatic influence, that herding behavior causes systematic poor outcomes, that independent thinking requires conscious effort, and that successful people resist social conformity. The conformity manifestations include investing because everyone else is despite overvaluation, adopting group beliefs without examination, making choices based on popularity, following conventional paths to mediocrity, conforming to group consensus despite private disagreement, and being unable to stand alone with correct position. The override strategies involve recognizing when social proof influences decision, asking what would I decide alone, seeking data not crowd behavior, being willing to reach different conclusion, treating independence as strength, and making decisions based on analysis, not popularity. The independent analysis protocol means evaluating decisions without reference to others, questioning why something is popular, seeking contradicting information, recognizing that crowds are often wrong, and valuing truth over social comfort. The contrarian consideration shows deliberately questioning popular choices, analyzing where the crowd is right, seeking reasons consensus might be wrong, making independent assessment, and treating popularity as irrelevant to correctness. The social pressure resistance involves being comfortable with unpopular correct positions, tolerating social discomfort of standing alone, refusing to conform for acceptance, maintaining conviction despite group pressure, and treating independence as competitive advantage. The crowd skepticism means remembering majorities are frequently wrong. Understanding popularity doesn't indicate quality, recognizing groupthink and herd behavior, questioning whether others made informed choices, and maintaining critical thinking despite numbers. The implementation requires identifying decisions where conformity controlled you, practicing independence from group, making decisions based purely on analysis, developing comfort with standing alone, seeking truth over social approval, and treating independent thinking as essential. Following crowd guarantees mediocrity. Independent thinking creates excellence. Think differently or stay average. You understand now that primitive conformity served tribal survival but sabotages modern competition, that following herd produces average results, that exceptional outcomes require independent analysis, that social pressure must be consciously resisted, and that Chapter 6 reveals how independent thinking override makes excellence possible, where social conformity made mediocrity inevitable. Chapter 7. Resist primitive status competition. Wasting resources on signaling. Resisting primitive status competition that wastes resources on signaling enables investing in actual value creation. The status override demonstrates that primitive brain competes for tribal status constantly. That status competition wastes resources on appearance. That signaling value is different from creating value. That successful people invest in substance, not status, and that overriding status instinct enables wealth building. Most people waste resources through buying status symbols instead of assets, caring more about appearance than reality, competing on consumption, not creation, spending to impress rather than invest, and not recognizing how status competition keeps them poor. Status competition wastes resources. Value creation builds wealth. Invest in substance or stay poor. Research demonstrates that status competition is hardwired instinct, that conspicuous consumption signals tribal position, that status spending prevents wealth accumulation, that millionaires avoid status competition, and that focusing on substance over signaling builds wealth. The status manifestations include buying expensive cars to signal status, living in expensive areas for appearance, wearing luxury brands for social proof, spending on visible consumption, choosing perception over reality, and letting status competition control spending. The override strategies involve recognizing status impulses, questioning whether purchase is substance or signal, investing in assets not status symbols, choosing value creation over appearance, being comfortable with unstated wealth, and treating status competition as trap. The substance versus signaling distinction means identifying purchases that create value versus project image, recognizing that wealthy avoid status displays, understanding that status spending prevents actual wealth building, choosing productive assets over consumption, and treating invisible wealth as superior. The stealth wealth practice shows being comfortable with appearing ordinary, refusing to signal status through consumption, investing money that others spend on status, building actual wealth, not appearance, and treating understated success as intelligence. The value creation focus involves spending on assets, producing returns, investing in skills and knowledge, building businesses, creating value, choosing income producing over status signaling purchases, and treating resource allocation as wealth determinant. The peer pressure resistance means refusing to keep up with status-driven spending, being comfortable with less visible lifestyle, ignoring social pressure to consume, maintaining focus on substance, and treating status competition as wealth destruction. The implementation requires identifying status-driven spending, redirecting resources to wealth building, choosing substance over signaling, being comfortable with stealth wealth, and treating actual value as superior to perceived status. Status competition wastes resources. Value creation builds wealth. Invest in substance or stay poor. You understand now that primitive status competition wastes resources on signaling, that appearance is different from reality, that millionaires avoid status displays, that substance beats signaling for wealth, and that Chapter 7 reveals how status competition override makes wealth building possible where primitive signaling made resource waste inevitable. Chapter 8. Stop primitive tribalism from limiting thinking and relationships. Stopping primitive tribalism that limits thinking and relationships enables broader perspective and stronger networks. The tribalism override demonstrates that primitive brain divides world into us versus them. That tribal loyalty was survival but limits modern potential. That in-group bias prevents objective thinking. That expanding beyond tribe enables growth. And that overriding tribalism creates opportunities. Most people are limited by tribalism through automatically favoring in-group, unable to see value in out-group, making biased decisions based on tribal loyalty, limiting relationships to similar people, and not recognizing how tribalism restricts potential. Tribalism limits potential. Diverse thinking creates advantage. Override bias or stay restricted. Research demonstrates that in-group bias operates automatically, that tribal thinking impairs judgment, that homogeneous networks limit opportunities, that diverse connections create advantage, and that overriding tribalism requires conscious effort. The tribalism manifestations include refusing to consider out-group ideas, making biased evaluations based on tribe, limiting network to similar people, tribal loyalty overriding merit, being unable to work with different groups, and letting us versus them thinking restrict possibilities. The override strategies involve recognizing tribal biases, deliberately seeking diverse perspectives, evaluating ideas independent of source, building bridges across groups, treating tribal impulses skeptically, and choosing merit over membership. The diverse perspective seeking means actively engaging people from different backgrounds, reading opposing viewpoints regularly, attending diverse events and groups, building relationships across tribal lines, and treating diversity as competitive advantage. The objective evaluation protocol shows assessing ideas based on merit, not source, questioning whether tribal loyalty influences judgment, forcing consideration of outgroup perspectives, using blind evaluation when possible, and treating origin as irrelevant to quality. The bridge-building practice involves creating connections across tribal boundaries, finding common ground with different groups, facilitating collaboration between tribes, serving as translator between perspectives, and treating bridge building as valuable skill. The us versus them recognition means catching tribal thinking in real time, questioning automatic in-group favoritism, recognizing when loyalty overrides judgment, identifying tribal bias in decisions, and treating tribalism as limitation requiring override. The implementation requires identifying tribal biases, deliberately engaging outgroups, evaluating objectively regardless of tribal affiliation, building diverse networks, and treating tribalism as limitation to override. Tribalism limits potential. Diverse thinking creates advantage. Override bias or stay restricted. You understand now that primitive tribalism divides world into us versus them, that in-group bias impairs objective thinking, that homogeneous networks limit opportunities, that diverse perspectives create advantage, and that Chapter 8 reveals how tribalism override makes broader potential possible, where primitive us versus them thinking made restriction inevitable. Chapter 9. Control primitive scarcity mindset. Preventing abundance thinking controlling. Primitive scarcity mindset that prevents abundance thinking enables growth and opportunity recognition. The scarcity override demonstrates that primitive brain assumes scarcity because ancestors faced real scarcity. That scarcity mindset causes defensive protective behavior. That abundance thinking enables growth and risk-taking. That modern world has unprecedented opportunity, and that overriding scarcity enables seeing and seizing opportunities. Most people operate from scarcity through hoarding resources defensively, unable to invest in growth, seeing world as zero-sum competition, making fear-based defensive decisions, and not recognizing how scarcity mindset prevents building. Scarcity mindset prevents growth. Abundance thinking creates opportunity. Shift perspective or stay defensive. Research demonstrates that scarcity mindset impairs cognitive function, that abundance thinking correlates with success, that scarcity creates tunnel vision, that opportunity recognition requires abundance perspective, and that mindset shift is possible through practice. The scarcity manifestations include hoarding money instead of investing, being unable to delegate or share, seeing others' success as your loss, making defensive protective choices, missing opportunities due to scarcity, tunnel vision, and letting fear of scarcity control all decisions. The override strategies involve recognizing scarcity thinking patterns, deliberately adopting abundance perspective, seeing opportunities not threats, investing in growth despite fear, treating world as non-zero-sum, and practicing generosity, building abundance mindset. The abundance reframing means viewing world as full of opportunity, recognizing unprecedented modern possibilities, seeing others' success as inspiration, not threat, understanding that value can be created, not just taken, and treating abundance as reality, not delusion. The investment orientation shows allocating resources to growth opportunities, being willing to spend on development, delegating and sharing rather than hoarding, taking calculated risks for expansion, and treating investment as wealth building, not loss. The non-zero-sum perspective involves recognizing that cooperation creates value, understanding that others' gain doesn't require your loss, seeing collaboration opportunities, treating relationships as mutually beneficial, and rejecting win-lose framing. The generosity practice means giving freely, building abundance mindset, sharing knowledge and resources, helping others succeed, treating generosity as investment, and recognizing that giving creates receiving. The implementation requires identifying scarcity-driven decisions, consciously reframing to abundance, investing in growth opportunities, treating giving as building abundance, and recognizing unprecedented modern opportunity. Scarcity mindset prevents growth. Abundance thinking creates opportunity. Shift perspective or stay defensive. You understand now that primitive scarcity thinking reflects ancestral reality, not modern possibility. That scarcity mindset creates tunnel vision, missing opportunities. That abundance thinking enables growth and risk-taking. That generosity builds abundance perspective. And that Chapter 9 reveals how scarcity override makes opportunity recognition possible where primitive defensive thinking made growth impossible. Chapter 10. Master systematic, primitive override, making rational control default. Mastering systematic primitive override makes rational control default, rather than requiring constant effort. The override mastery demonstrates that overriding primitive requires deliberate practice, that repeated override creates new automatic patterns, that rational thinking becomes habitual through training, that building override capacity is progressive, and that permanent override requires permanent practice. Most people never master override through occasional attempts without consistency, expecting rational to be automatic without training, not practicing override systematically, failing to build habits, supporting rational control, and treating override as knowledge, not skill, requiring practice. Occasional override creates nothing. Daily practice builds mastery. Practice systematically or stay primitive. Research demonstrates that override capacity improves with deliberate practice, that consistent training creates lasting change, that rational patterns become automatic through repetition, that neuroplasticity enables habit formation, and that systematic practice is essential for mastery. The override practice protocol includes identifying one primitive pattern to override daily, implementing deliberate pause before automatic reactions, questioning whether primitive or rational drives decision, practicing override in small decisions, building capacity, tracking primitive versus rational choices, celebrating successful overrides, and treating override as daily practice. The automaticity development means initial override requires significant effort, that repeated practice makes override easier, that rational patterns become increasingly automatic, that primitive instincts still arise but rational override happens faster, and that permanent practice creates permanent capacity. The progressive training involves starting with easiest overrides, building confidence, gradually tackling more difficult primitive reactions, practicing in various contexts and situations, maintaining consistency even when difficult, celebrating progress, tracking improvement, using successful overrides as evidence of capability, and treating development as long-term project. The daily practice commitment shows choosing specific primitive pattern to focus on, implementing structured pause before reactions, tracking primitive versus rational decisions daily, reviewing patterns weekly, identifying progress, maintaining practice indefinitely, not temporarily, and treating override as permanent lifestyle. The multiple pattern integration means practicing override across all primitive sabotage areas, recognizing connections between patterns, building comprehensive rational control, treating primitive override as holistic system, and maintaining vigilance across all domains. The implementation requires committing to daily override practice, choosing specific primitive patterns to focus on, implementing structured pause before reactions, tracking decisions daily, reviewing patterns weekly, maintaining practice permanently, and treating primitive override as essential life skill requiring systematic development, making modern success possible where primitive control makes it impossible. Occasional override creates nothing. Daily practice builds mastery. Practice systematically or stay primitive. You understand now that override capacity builds through deliberate practice, that rational patterns become automatic through repetition, that systematic training creates lasting change, that permanent practice is essential, and that Chapter 10 completes comprehensive framework revealing how systematic override mastery makes rational control default, where primitive domination made strategic thinking impossible. You have learned how to stop your primitive brain from sabotaging you. Understand dual brain system and why primitive wins by default. Stop fear response from preventing risk and growth. Override loss, aversion keeping you poor. Resist present bias, destroying long-term success. Control anger, preventing strategic response. Override social conformity, keeping you mediocre. Resist status competition, wasting resources. Stop tribalism, limiting thinking. Control scarcity mindset, preventing abundance. Master systematic override, making rational control default. What matters now is implementing these override strategies starting immediately. 5 implementation priorities starting today. Study dual brain systems thoroughly. Identify your dominant primitive sabotage patterns. Implement systematic pause before automatic reactions. Practice override in daily decisions, building capacity. Commit to permanent daily practice. Execute these practices consistently. Build override capacity progressively, and master primitive brain control. Stop being controlled by primitive instincts, and start overriding destructive programming. Stop reacting primitively, and start responding strategically. Understand dual brain systems, recognize primitive sabotage patterns, implement systematic override strategies, develop conscious control, and master primitive brain override, making modern success possible that primitive control makes permanently impossible through commitment, starting now.